Okay, so welcome back. Today we're gonna continue speaking about semi-modals. We were checking on the last two videos. We were speaking about modal verbs for obligation and necessity, and modal verbs for ability, capacity, or necessity. Okay, so right now we're gonna be speaking about some more modal verbs or semi-modal verbs. We're gonna be speaking about modal and semi-modal verbs for the future. But before that, let's just do a little review of what a modal and a semi-modal are. It says semi-modals are very similar to modal verbs, and they share some of their characteristics. Okay, so I'm gonna just write down here a couple of sentences. You can say, I must go to school. Or you can say, I have to go to school. We have two sentences that are very similar because you have, again, your subject, then you have your auxiliary, or in this case, it's not an auxiliary, it's a modal verb or a semi-modal verb. The first one is a modal verb, the second one is a semi-modal verb, so we're gonna call them modal. This one is a semi-modal verb, have to. Then we need, let me just choose the color, I can't, that's it. Then we need a verb. When we have modal verbs or semi-modal verbs, the verb is always in the base form, always, yeah? And then we have whatever extra information that we need, that is going to be the complement, okay? The complement is always optional, and these are affirmative statements in the present, yeah? They never use the auxiliary do, because when you have a modal verb, you cannot have an auxiliary. This is impossible. But they read as if they were in present. They are in present. That's pretty much the way it works. Now the thing is, there is a difference between modal verbs and semi-modal verbs. When you have a modal verb is, I think, way easier, because when you have a modal verb, if you want to make the sentence negative, the modal verb takes the negative. So must becomes mustn't, and that's it. If you want to make a question, the subject and the modal verb, they have to switch positions. It's not subject modal, it's modal subject. So you take this away and you use it at the beginning. Must I go to school? If you want to make an information question, you start with why or when or where or how must I go to school? And that's pretty much it. It is very simple with modal verbs. The problem with modal verbs is that they only work with the present. When you say I must always means in the present. What happens with the semi-modal verb? The semi-modal verb is way more difficult to use, because in the semi-modal verb, well, I have to go to school, but what happens if you have a different subject? If you have a different subject, for example, the third person of the singular, yeah, this modal verb, technically, the semi-modal verb is not in present, past, or future, but this semi-modal verb, technically, it is in the present. So if we have a modal verb in the present, a semi-modal verb in the present, we have to follow the rules of the present. In the present, I hope that you remember, the third person of the singular takes an S. So instead of have to, we say has to. This is because this is an affirmative statement. He has to go to school. What happens if you want to make it negative? The modal verb takes the negative. But in this case, you don't say hasn't. Why not? Because this is in the simple present. In the simple present, the auxiliary is not has. Do you remember what the auxiliary is for the simple present? The auxiliary for the simple present, if you don't remember, I will remind you, is does. And then have to. So thus is the one that takes the negative. Let me make it a little bit smaller so it fits. Thus, and then have to. If you want to make it negative, what do? The auxiliary of the present takes the negative. Doesn't. Because you have does, you don't have to say has. These are the rules of the present, right? I hope that you remember that. I hope that you remember how to make, I hope that you remember how to make a question. Thus, have to, only the auxiliary switches positions with the subject. Does he have to go to school? This will be a question, okay? It is way more difficult to use modal verbs. Semi-modal verbs. They are way more difficult. You have to think about the rules and everything. But what is the good thing about them? The good thing about them is that you can change the time tense. I must go to school. It is always, this is always and forever in present. But the semi-modal verb, it can be in the present, in the past, in the future. It can combine modals with semi-modals. So you can say, for example, if you want to make it in the past, you don't say have to. You say had to. This is in the simple past. In the simple past, the verb takes the past form. And when you say he had to go to school, it means not now, but in the past he had the obligation. How do you make it negative? Hadn't. No. Why not? Because remember that in the simple past, the auxiliary is not had. What is the auxiliary for the simple past? The auxiliary for the simple past is did. We didn't use it because in affirmative statements, in the simple past, we never use it. But when we make negative statements, this is necessary because it takes the negative. And then the verb. He didn't have to go to school. Because you have the auxiliary did, you don't say had, you say have. You don't have to change the verb. The only reason that we change the verb is because we didn't have the auxiliary. In negatives, the auxiliary is mandatory, right? What happens if you want to make a question? Well, only the auxiliary, the did have to, sorry. Let me erase this because it is a little small and it doesn't really read. When you have did, you use have, not had, because you have did. When you want to make a question, only this switches positions with the subject, auxiliary subject. Did he have to go to school? You're asking, this is a yes, no question. Did he have to go to school? Yes, he had to go to school. No, he didn't have to go to school. That's pretty much the way it works. So it is harder. It is way harder than the modal verbs, but it is also way more, how to say it? It is way more flexible. You can say many different things that you couldn't say with just must. Yeah. If you want to speak about the future, what do? Well, the semi-modal verb have to in the future. So the future of have to is will have to. So the semi-modal verb have to is in the future, will have to. He will have to go to school. So he doesn't have to go to school in the present. He doesn't have the obligation or the necessity, but in the future, he will have that obligation, right? If you want to make a question, it is very simple again. If you want to make a question, only the auxiliary switches positions with the subject. Will he have to go to school? In the future, is it going to be necessary for him to go to school? I am not speaking about right now. I am speaking about in the future. Yeah, this is pretty much the way it works. And as I was telling you, it's even better because when you have, for example, let's write that one again. When you have will and you have to, you have two parts. You have one part, will, that is telling you, hey, this is future. And then you have another part, have to, that is telling you, hey, this is an obligation. So you're speaking about two things at the same time. You're speaking about obligation, but also you're speaking about future. Yeah. So when you can change semi-modal verbs, they express obligation in this case, you can combine them with future, you can combine them with past, you can combine them with many different things. Even you can combine them with other modal verbs. For example, a modal verb for possibility. Again, you can combine them with possibility. And then instead of using will means future, so we're not going to use will. Instead of using will, you can use something different. You can use, for example, possibility could. He could have to go to school. He could have to go to school. He probably, there is a possibility that he has the obligation of going to school. He could, possibility, have to, obligation, go to school. He could have to go to school. Yeah, I am not sure. It is a possibility. Yeah, this is pretty much the way they work. This is the important thing about semi-modal verbs. We were checking this in more depth on the past video when we were speaking about semi-modal verbs for obligation and necessity. But this is how they work. Okay, they have some things in common with the modal verbs. You have subject, you have modal verb or semi-modal verb, you have verb, and you have complement. Another thing is that must, yes, and have to, both of them mean obligation or necessity. So they have an extra meaning. They are telling you how or in which way is this verb. This verb is an obligation. He has to go to school. So this is an obligation and this is the verb. And also the verbs are always in the base form. They have all these things in common. The things that they do not have in common is that this one can be conjugated. It can be conjugated in the present, in the past, in the future with other modal verbs, so you can combine meanings. So knowing semi-modal verbs is very, very useful because it is in a way, they are very flexible. They are the only way to say many different things that we wouldn't have a way to say. Yeah. They are placed between the subject and blah, 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 blah. This is pretty much the same thing that we were saying. You have subject, auxiliary, or in this case, modal verb, verb in the base form, and complement. You have subject, you have your semi-modal verb. The difference is that when you have a semi-modal verb, if this is in the present, it's following the rules of the present. Must is always must. It's never musts. Yeah? You never, ever, ever write the word musts. Why not? Because modal verbs are the way they are. They are never conjugated. But semi-modal verbs, they are conjugated. Why? Because they are in the present, in the past, in the future, in whatever. So if they are in the present, they need to follow the rules of the present. That is pretty much the problem with them. Also, you have the verb. It is always in the base form, the same. And then you have your complement. Okay, so this is just a little reminder of what we were speaking about on the last class, on the last few lessons. We're going to continue with another type of modal verb. We were checking in the past two videos modal verbs for ability and possibility and permission. And we were checking also modal verbs and semi-modal verbs for obligation and necessity on the past video. Right now, we're going to move on a little bit and we're going to speak about modal verbs for the future. Modal verbs for the future. So what is this? Let me just pick out the tool. It says there are some modal verbs that only imply that the action in the sentence is in future. So we have, for example, the modal verb will. Will is a bit of a weird case because we know that will is the auxiliary of future. But some people say that will is actually not an auxiliary. It's a modal verb that means future. This is a very nerdy conversation. This is a very nerdy argument. I don't think it is important if will is a modal verb or an auxiliary. I think there are reasons for both postures. It is an auxiliary because it's speaking about time. It's telling you the time. Auxiliaries, they are normally telling you the time. So will is telling you the time. I think this is an auxiliary. But also it is like a modal verb because whenever you have will, you use the verb in the base form. Whenever you use will in the base form, that's with modal verbs. Can be, could be, should be, must be, will be. After every modal verb, the verbs are always on the base form. So, I mean, will, it can, you can call it, I don't know, you can call it an auxiliary for the future. You can call it a modal verb that implies future, but it doesn't really matter because we know that modal verbs and auxiliaries are pretty much the same thing. Yes, you have subject, then you have auxiliary or modal, then you have verb, and then you have complement. So if it is an auxiliary or a modal verb, it's not really important. It is in the same position and it uses the same things. It means the same things. It says, such is the case of the modal verb will, that we also known as the auxiliary for the future. Let's remember that auxiliaries and modal verbs are almost the same thing. People say will is an auxiliary because it changes the meaning of a sentence, changing the time of the action, like auxiliaries do, sorry. But it also requires a verb in the base form after it, like modal verbs do, and it's never conjugated to the subject. So you never say wills, you never say willth. With the other auxiliaries, you have do and does, you have and has, you have am, are, and is, you have was and were. Will is always will. So I don't know, it can be a modal verb, but it refers to a time tense. It can be an auxiliary. I mean, it's not really important, okay? It says whether will is an auxiliary or a modal verb is unimportant because there's objectively no difference between them. There is really no difference between an auxiliary and a modal verb. Yeah, I mean, they go in the same place. Normally, the only difference is auxiliaries tell you the time and modal verbs tell you something about the action, the way. Will is telling you the time, but it's also, well, the time is a way of the action. So it's pretty much the same thing. We need to know that will doesn't only mean future, but it also means certainty. This is very important. This is an important part because we need to remember that when you use will, for example, if you say, I will buy a house. When you're using the the modal verb, sorry, or the auxiliary will means two things. Will doesn't only mean, will doesn't only mean future. Yes, it means future, but also it means future. But also it means certainty. When you say I will buy a house, you are saying in the future and with certainty. You're like making a promise or a prediction. You are committing yourself to something. It's like, this is going to happen. I want this to happen. I will buy a house. Okay, you're saying that you will do what you will do. Sorry. So I will buy a house. Again, you have will, and you have will means future and certainty. If you don't want certainty, you can use an adverb. I will probably, or I will maybe buy a house. If you use this adverb, then you are saying future, but you are not implying certainty. You are taking away the certainty from this. Does it make sense? I hope it makes sense. So, okay. The thing is, it says when you say I will run, you're saying that the action is in the future, but you are also making a promise or a prognostication. Okay, so you are speaking about both these things. Let's move on. Will, this may be a little bit a surprise for some people, but I think we spoke about this at the beginning of the semester. Will is not the only modal verb that means future. May means future and might means future. When you say I will run, it means in the future and also for sure. You're saying that it's a certainty. Again, when you're using will, it is in the future, but you're also expressing certainty. When you use may, it means in the future, but not for sure. As you may have noticed, may and might, they have multiple uses. We use them for permission, and also we can use them for future. Up to this point, después de aquí vamos a empezar a usar modales que van a empezar a dobletear en su función, que van a tener 2 funciones o 3 funciones, o se van a poder usar para varias cosas, okay? When you're using may, it means in the future, but not for sure. I may run. So tomorrow I may run. It means, I mean, in the future, but maybe. I mean, I don't really have to. I might run, again, in the future, but not for sure. May and might are pretty much interchangeable, okay? You can use whichever one you want. If you don't want the certainty, you can say, again, an adverb, probably, or maybe. When you say, I will probably run, or I maybe run, well, I may be running, well, whatever. I may run. In this case, you are not asserting anything. You never use these adverbs, you never use them with may or with might, because it will be redundant. May and might, they mean uncertainty. So you don't need to say, I may probably run. I mean, it's like repeating. It's, again, a little bit redundant. It is not really necessary. Okay, so we have 3 modal verbs for the future: will, may, and might. Sorry. The difference is will is future and certainty. May and might, they are future, but they are not certainty. Okay. Then we have this semi-modal verbs for the future. Okay. So the problem is, well, we have a modal verb. We have 3 modal verbs. We have, let me just change this. We have might, we have may, and we have will. Okay, this is an affirmative statement. I might go out tonight. Might in the future, probably, not certainty. I may not go out tonight. This is a negative statement. The modal verb takes the negative. You don't have the contraction mayn't or mightn't. And this is a question. Will I go out tonight? This is a question. You start with the modal verb and then you have the subject. We have these 3 modal verbs. This one is future but uncertainty, future but uncertainty, future but certainty. I mean, uncertainty. Okay. On top of this modal verbs, we have 1 semi-modal verb, be going to. I think you may remember this. You have checked it probably in school, in the 2nd semester, in the 3rd semester, in elementary school, I don't know. You have checked it before. Be going to is very similar to will, because it means future and certainty. When you are using be going to, this is future, but it is also certainty. One very, very, very important part of this is be going to, not going to. Many people say, will and going to. No, it's not going to. It is be going to. Why be going to? Because be going to is very, very important, because this part is probably the most important part. Remember that technically this is a semi-modal verb, okay? So this is kind of weird. This is a semi-modal verb and it means future. You have your subject, your semi-modal verb that means future, be going to, and then you have your verb in the base form. The thing is that this is technically, well, I mean, this is in the future, but technically this is in the present continuous, because you have the verb to be in the present and then you have a verb with ing. Yes? So in the present continuous, you follow the rules. When you have the first person of the singular, the verb to be is conjugated in the present. It can be am, are, or is. In the case of I am going to. If you have a different subject, he, then you will have to change is not going to, right? Remember also, let me just, I'm going to change this a little bit. Okay, let's imagine that we have a negative statement. And this negative statement is going to have a different subject. The subject is going to be he. because the subject is he, the verb to be is going to be conjugated like this, is. If you make it negative, the verb to be is the one taking the negative. He isn't going to go out. So this part is super important. This part is super important because this is the verb. This is the verb, this is the verb conjugated to the person, and this is the verb taking the negative. The rest of it is just the rest of the modal verb. So the modal verb is be going to. Again, the modal verb is not going to, is be going to. Why? Because this part is going to have to change. It's going to have to change to am going to, are going to, is going to. It's going to take the negative. I'm not going to, aren't going to, isn't going to. And it is also going to change positions with the subject. If you want to make a question, then you start with the auxiliary, in this case the verb to be, and then the subject, and then the rest of it. Am I going to go out tonight? Yes? Does it make sense? Again, we have future uncertainty, future uncertainty, future uncertainty. Will and be going to are very, very similar. Will y be going to son muy parecidos. Los dos significan futuro y los dos significan certeza. Son diferentes porque will siempre es will, nunca es wills, nunca es willed, nunca es, no se conjuga, los verbos van en forma base, es un modal común y corriente. Y be going to es un semimodal. Y como es un semimodal, es un poco más complicado porque, bueno, tiene que seguir las reglas del tiempo en el que está. Este semimodal técnicamente nos está hablando del futuro, pero técnicamente está en presente continuo. Tiene el verbo to be y un verbo con ing. Entonces, técnicamente está en el presente continuo, aunque signifique futuro. Como está en el presente continuo, esta parte be es la más importante porque es la que tenemos que conjugar al sujeto. Si el sujeto es I, am. Si el sujeto es you, are. Si el sujeto es he, is. ¿Sí? Tenemos que conjugar esta parte para que quede bien. No podemos decir nada más I be going to. Ni podemos decir I going to. Si dicen I going to, les voy a poner un 5. Porque ese es un error que vienen haciendo desde siempre. Going to, going to, going to. O sea, de la peor parte de la que se pueden olvidar es del be. Esta es la que cambia. Esta es la que se lleva el negativo si hacemos una oración negativa. Esta es la que cambia su lugar con el sujeto si hacemos una pregunta. Entonces, si me ponen I going to, de verdad un 5, ¿sí? No olviden esta parte, el be going to. Be es la parte más importante. El going to es un adorno. El going to aquí no cambia, no cambia, no cambia, no cambia, no hace nada. Lo importante es el be. Este es el que se conjuga al sujeto, este es el que se lleva el negativo, este es el que cambia su lugar con el auxiliar. Perdón, con el sujeto para hacer preguntas. Ahora, este semimodal, this semi-modal be going to, we don't really have to change it to past or to present. It is unnecessary to change this to past or to present. Why? Well, it is unnecessary because if you have a sentence in the future and you want to say it in the present, you say it in the present. ¿Sí? Si tienen una oración en el futuro y quieren decirla en el pasado o en el presente, pues usen el pasado o el presente. No es necesario que el semimodal cambie. ¿Para qué? ¿Sí? Si yo quiero decir, yo saldré en la noche, bueno, I will go out. Pero si lo quiero decir en presente, pues lo digo en presente. I go out. I do go out. Yo salgo. Si lo quiero decir en pasado, I went out. Yo salí. O sea, no es necesario que el semimodal le cambie el tiempo. Porque aquí no estás hablando ni de obligación, ni de necesidad, ni de posibilidad. Estás hablando ya del futuro. Y si lo quieres cambiar a pasado o a presente, pues usa el pasado o el presente. No es necesario. Este semimodal realmente no cambia ni a pasado ni a presente, pero sí tiene una manera en la que puede cambiar. Si en lugar de usarlo en presente continuo, lo usamos en pasado continuo, en lugar de I'm going to, o are going to, o is going to, we use it as in the past, was going to, or were going to. If we change this to the past, aquí no estamos cambiando la oración a pasado. Lo que estamos hablando es de una cosa que es a future canceled, un futuro cancelado. Sigue siendo futuro, pero ya no es el plan, ¿sí? If you say, I was going to go out tonight, yo iba a salir en la noche. O sea, el plan era que yo saliera esta noche, pero algo pasó, no sé qué pasó. Al final me quedé trabajando, tengo mucha tarea, tuve cosas que hacer, etc. Entonces, este semimodal también tiene la flexibilidad de cambiar, puede estar en presente o en pasado, pero eso no lo convierte en una oración en pasado. ¿Por qué? Porque otra vez aquí, si estamos hablando de futuro y lo queremos pasar a pasado, pues usamos el pasado, para eso existe. Aquí lo que pasa es que si cambiamos este semimodal, sigue siendo futuro, pero ahora es un futuro cancelado, ¿sí? Cuando dices, I was going to go to Spain, yo iba a ir a España. O sea, ese era el plan. Next week, I was going to go to Spain. La semana que entra, yo iba a ir a España. O sea, otra vez, está en el futuro. Sí, sigue estando en el futuro. La semana que entra, no ya. Pero la semana que entra, ese era el plan. La semana que entra, ese ya no es el plan. Más o menos. Es un poco raro, pero este semimodal no cambia el tiempo. Lo que cambia es el futuro. Perdón, lo cancela el futuro. ¿Ustedes se acuerdan que los semimodales tenían otra cosa que era muy importante? Espero que lo recuerden. Los semimodales también pueden combinar modales con tiempos, ¿sí? O modales con semimodales. Entonces aquí, por ejemplo, podemos tener, vamos a ver, ¿qué pasa si yo quiero hablar de futuro? Sí. Perdón, aquí lo tengo en blanco, entonces no se va a ver. ¿Qué pasa si yo quiero hablar de futuro, pero también quiero hablar de obligación? Quiero hablar de futuro y de obligación. Bueno, tengo varias maneras. Puedo usarlo con los de obligación en futuro. I will have to. I will have to go. Podría ser. O otra cosa que puedo hacer es, bueno, aquí tengo este semimodal que significa futuro. Y le puedo poner aquí un modal que signifique obligación. Le puedo poner, por ejemplo, should. Y el verbo no es going to, es be going to. Después de should, el verbo siempre va en forma base. I should be going to go out tonight. Yo debería estar saliendo esta noche. En el futuro y obligación. Yo tendría que estar saliendo esta noche. Sería una obligación que yo estuviera saliendo esta noche. Entonces, lo bueno de los semimodales es que pueden combinarse con otros modales o con auxiliares para cambiarles el tiempo. En el caso de del futuro es un poquito diferente porque no les vamos a cambiar el tiempo. ¿Para qué? Ya están en futuro, si los queremos cambiar de tiempo, pues los decimos en otro tiempo y ya. No hay necesidad de estar de reinventar la rueda, ¿ok? Ya por último, bueno, esto no tiene nada que ver, pero se me hace muy cortito para hacer otro video. Vamos a hablar de un semimodal en pasado. Solo hay un semimodal en pasado. El pasado simple, ustedes lo recuerdan. The simple past, you have your subject, your auxiliary, your verb, and your complement. Because you have an affirmative statement, the auxiliary is optional, or you never use it. So you say something like, you never use the auxiliary, the verb changes to past, went, and then the complement, to Cancun. Okay? I went to Cancun. This is the simple past. Yes? We have a semi-modal verb. We can say, instead of the auxiliary, we can use a semi-modal verb that means past. We can say, I used to go to Cancun. It is a little different. We have, again, we have subject, yes. We have auxiliary or semi-modal. We have the auxiliary. The auxiliary, we never use it in affirmative. The semi-modal verb, we need to use it. We have a verb. When you have a semi-modal verb, the verb is in the base form. When you have the simple past, if you don't have the auxiliary, the verb is in the past. And then we have our complement, to Cancun. Okay? I went to Cancun. I used to go to Cancun. What is the difference? Well, the difference is that this one is a finished action. This is the simple past. I went to Cancun. And that's over. I finished. I went to Cancun. This is, you use used to when you're speaking about, how do we say it? You use used to when you're speaking about a routine in the past. You use used to speak about routines in the past. Like normally when I was a kid, when I was little, when I was living in Mexico City, when I was living in Yucatan, I used to go to Cancun. So it was normal to go to Cancun. It was a routine. It was something that I was normally doing. Yeah. I used to play soccer with my friends. When I was a kid and I was living in a different neighborhood and I had friends of my age, I used to play soccer with them. So it was regular. It was normal in the past to play soccer with them. So this is a little different because the simple past is just for finished actions. And this semi-modal verb is in the past, but is used to speak about routines in the past. I used to go out. I used to do that. It means in the past, it was something that I was accustomed to do. And right now, I just don't do it anymore. Yeah. This one, how do you make it negative? The problem is that this is a semi-modal verb. And because it is a semi-modal verb, it is in the past. If you want to make it, you have, again, used to. This is an affirmative statement. How do you make it negative? In the simple past, to make them negative, you need the auxiliary. What is the auxiliary of the past? Did. Did takes the negative and then use to. In this case, you don't really need the anymore. You don't need the because you have the auxiliary. The only reason that you were using this is because you didn't have the auxiliary, just to show the past. I didn't use to go to Cancun. So it was not a routine of mine to go to Cancun. This is the problem. Auxiliaries, well, very simple. If you want to make an auxiliary negative, the only thing that you do, if you want to make a simple past in negative, you say didn't, and then the verb is not went, the verb is go. In this case, you say didn't use to go. I didn't use to go. How do you make a question? The auxiliary switches positions. The auxiliary is normally in affirmative. So you say, did I go to Cancun? Finish action. Or you say, did I used to go to Cancun? Finished action. I mean, routine. Was it normal for us to go to Cancun? Again, you have your modal verb, your semi-modal verb or your auxiliary, the simple past, the auxiliary did, and the semi-modal verb used to. And then you have your verb. In the case of the simple past, it can be, sorry, I think I forgot. I didn't make it big enough. This one is from here to here. Okay. So in the simple past, you use the verb like this when you have the auxiliary. If you don't have the auxiliary, the verb changes to the past. In the semi-modal verb, if you're using affirmative, used to. If you're not using the affirmative, if you're making a negative or a question, you need the auxiliary and the verb doesn't have the. And the verb here is always in the past part. Sorry, this verb is always in the base form. Modal verbs and semi-modal verbs, they are always in the base form. Yeah. I used to go out every night. We have some examples here. It says subject, semi-modal verb, verb in the base form, and complement. I used to go out every night. This is an affirmative statement. Then what happens when you make them negative? When you make them negative, you need the auxiliary didn't. In this case, the did, we never use it because this is an affirmative. And when we don't have the auxiliary, we use the the. In this case, we have the auxiliary with the negative, and the verb doesn't need a the. This is okay. The verb is always in the base form. If you want to make a question, again, this auxiliary from the past, then the subject, and then the rest of the semi-modal verb. Remember, when your auxiliary on your your semi-modal verb is multiple words, only the first one switches positions with the subject. The verb is always in the base form, and then you have the complement. En este caso, tampoco cambiamos ni a presente ni a futuro. No hay necesidad de cambiar este modal porque es un modal en pasado. Si queremos decir esto mismo en futuro, pues lo decimos en futuro. I will go to Cancún. Si quiero decirlo en presente, pues lo digo en presente. I go to Cancún. No es necesario que cambiemos este semimodal para cambiarle el tiempo, porque como está en pasado, pues si lo queremos decir en futuro, lo decimos en futuro. Si lo queremos decir en presente, lo decimos en presente y se acabó. No hay necesidad de hacer nada más. Con esto acabamos la parte de semimodales. Todavía nos faltan otros modales, pero los siguientes modales funcionan de una manera un poquito diferente. Los siguientes modales no van a utilizar no van a usar semimodales. Estos son todos los semimodales que hay, creo, que yo recuerde. Al rato les investigo si hay algún video extra sobre ese. O bueno, si alguien tiene alguna duda con una frase que piensa que puede ser un semimodal, me lo pueden preguntar y ya les explico yo si sí es, si se me olvidó, o si no es, cómo es que funciona. Pero espero que les quede claro cómo funcionan los modales, cómo funcionan los semimodales y por qué es importante entender los dos. Porque el idioma es muy flexible, pero para poder usar toda la flexibilidad del idioma, tenemos que ser capaces de utilizarlos los dos, ¿sí? Es muy fácil usar can, es muy fácil usar must, es muy fácil usar will, pero a veces es importante que variemos un poquito nuestro vocabulario y utilicemos los semimodales porque no hay otra manera de decir ciertas cosas, ¿sí? Hay ciertas ideas que no se pueden comunicar a menos de que usemos semimodales, ¿ok? Espero que esto les sea útil, espero que no estén muy atosigados todavía. Ya llevamos, me parece, para esta altura deberíamos llevar la mitad del semestre, un poco así. Todavía tenemos temas que ver, pero esos temas son más complejos y necesitamos para entonces que esto tenga cierto sentido. Otra vez, no se preocupen si sienten que la clase es muy rápida, que es demasiada información, que no le están procesando al mismo tiempo. Tenemos un semestre, tenemos 90 horas para checar todos los temas y no hay manera de llegar a los temas finales si no tenemos este fundamento, ¿ok? Entonces, el chiste no es que porque vieron un video de 25 minutos, de 40 minutos, de 50 minutos, ustedes ya son capaces de utilizar esto perfectamente todo el tiempo. Van a tener que hacer ejercicios. Les voy a dejar ejercicios, vamos a seguir checando algunas de estas cosas. Pero bueno, el problema es que el chiste aquí es que ustedes puedan, el propósito es que ustedes puedan empezar desde el principio y llegar hasta el final y cubrir todo el programa y tener una idea de cómo funciona el idioma en general. Okay? I think that's it for today, or well, for this video at least. If you want to continue checking videos, you're welcome to. Thank you very much, and well, I think I will see you soon. I will see you next time.